But anyway, that's Mark. And that's all the Christian story had in the 8th decade. And then in the 9th decade, Matthew comes along. We date Matthew between 83 and 85. Matthew copies 90% of Mark into his corpus. You could lose every copy of Mark in the world and reproduce 90% of it by extrapolating from Matthew. But he adds some things to the story. The virgin birth enters the tradition in the 9th decade in the writings of Matthew. But it's not the virgin birth story you're mostly familiar with. Matthew doesn't know anything about angels or shepherds or mangers. That comes even later. But it's the first miraculous birth account to enter the Christian tradition. Matthew adds a parable that had never appeared before. He adds a couple of them, but the most familiar one is the parable of the judgment, where the sheep and the goats are divided. It's only in Matthew, doesn't appear anywhere else. And Matthew is the first gospel writer to give you appearance stories of the risen Christ, and the first one to even quote the risen Christ as having said anything to anybody. That's not happened before. Then in the last part of the 9th decade, and maybe even the early years of the 10th decade, somewhere between 88 and 93, I would date Luke. And Luke is quite different. He also copies Mark, but not nearly as slavishly. Maybe 50% of Mark shows up in Luke. He adds a birth story, but it's very different from Matthew's birth story. This is the one that we build our pageants around. If you go to Christmas pageants, that's where most people learn about the birth stories. It's not from studying them. You go to Christmas pageants, you follow Luke's storyline, and then they tack Matthew's wise men on at the end of the pageant. So the wise men come to the stable. The only trouble is there's no stable. In Matthew, Mary and Joseph and the Christ child are inhabitants of the city of Bethlehem, and they live in a house. Go read the text. People just don't ever read the text. They just go to parables or to pageants and think they know something about the biblical story. In any event, Luke makes the resurrection very physical. It's only in Luke that Jesus talks and walks and teaches and offers his body to be felt by the people who are doubting whether or not this resurrection is actually correct. He interprets Scripture to say everything in the Old Testament refers to me, and he begins to show them how. And Luke is the one that introduces the story of Jesus' ascension. Never been in the story before. And he also introduces the story of Pentecost. That's Luke's additions. Nobody else has those stories. John makes a reference to ascension. And John says that Pentecost came on Easter evening when Jesus breathed on the disciples. Luke says it came 50 days after the resurrection. If you're a fundamentalist, you have a hard time making those two things be consistent. But fundamentalists don't worry about being consistent. Then, in the last part of the 10th decade, you get the Gospel of John. Very different from all of the rest of them. In John, Jesus becomes pre-existent. John is the Gospel that stands behind the later doctrinal development in the church that we call incarnation, and even the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, neither of which got shaped until the 4th century. But they base their arguments primarily on John. Now what I want you to see in this brief analysis, and we could take a whole year to just do what I've done, what I want you to see is that there is movement and development in the Christian story. The Bible did not drop from heaven fully written, divided into chapters and verses, and in the King James Version, as some people seem to think. The Bible is an ongoing story where they build on what was there before, and new things are constantly being brought into the narrative. It's only, well, look at some of the changes. In the earliest Gospels, Mark and Matthew, Jesus says only one thing from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Incredibly human cry. When you get to Luke and John, that cry has disappeared. because the concept of Jesus has gotten more and more divine and less human. And so Jesus says, as if crucifixion is like going to a church picnic, Jesus says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And in John he says, it is finished, because John has portrayed Jesus as the new creator. John opens with the words, in the beginning, just like the book of Genesis. And then John gets to the story of Jesus, and he has Jesus complete the new creation, just like God completed the creation. God did it in 6 days. Jesus completes the work of salvation, the work of a new creation, and then he goes into his Sabbath of rest in the tomb, just like God observed his Sabbath of rest in the creation story. It's not a static story. It's a growing, developing story. And if we can show, as I hope I've just done, the growth in the tradition between 70 and 100 as the Gospels come into being, then what I'd like for you to do is raise a question. How much did that story grow in this period where we have no records? We can document the growth of the story from 70 to 100 because we know the order in which the books are written. We can see new things coming in. We can see old things being taken out. But how much did it grow between 30 and 51? How can we get back to some understanding of that? Well, that's going to be our task. One other illustration. When Mark introduces Jesus, this is the first gospel, chapter 1. When Mark introduces Jesus, he is a fully adult, fully human being. And he comes to be baptized. And in the baptism, Mark says, the heavens opened, the Spirit of God poured down upon him, and he became a God-infused human being. And the voice from off stage says, this is my beloved Son. That's very different from when you get to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was enfleshed in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and we beheld his glory. The understanding of Jesus has grown dramatically between Mark and John. And the Christian debate that went on for the first 500 years of Christian history as to how you reconcile the full humanity of Jesus with the full divinity of Jesus is something that literally the church expended its energy for 500 years trying to figure that out. Now, most of these things we've known for a long time. Wonder why they never have gotten communicated to the average person who sits in the average church. This is not new. It's not something Spong developed. As if, he wants to be controversial as part of my image. But it's not something I developed. I've simply communicated it. And we've failed to communicate it. These things are not new. We have, for example, known for a long time that there is hardly a detail in the resurrection narratives of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John that isn't contradicted in another one of the Gospels. They're not a consistent story. They don't fit together simply. Even the two birth stories, we've woven them together in Christmas pageants for so long that people think it's a consistent story. But it's not. Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth in Luke. So Luke has to get them up to Bethlehem because everybody knows the child has to be born in David's birthplace. So Luke develops a census. The only trouble with that census is you can't find any records of it historically. And it says that it was done when Quirinius became governor of Syria, and the only problem is we can go to secular records and we discover that Quirinius didn't become the governor of Syria until the winter of 6-7 AD. Jesus would have been 11 years old by that time. And he makes this strange case that all the descendants of King David have got to go back to Bethlehem. King David had about 300 wives. There were 55 generations between King David and Jesus. He would have had more than 1 billion direct heirs. It's no wonder there was no room in the inn.